A low-class grunt, like you will never understand your sister's elegance. My mom sneered in disgust, smoothing the creases of her expensive silk dress. Her eyes looked at my army uniform like it was a piece of trash. Right in the middle of the engagement dinner, Julian, my sister's upper-class fiance, chuckled along, trudging through the mud and rain as a soldier. I bet you've never even touched real crocodile leather, have you? At the corner of the table, my aunt cowardly hung her head, staying completely silent. The humiliation coming from my own flesh and blood tore through my chest, my hands calloused from holding a rifle clenched into tight fists. I stood up abruptly, stone cold, and slammed the stack of financial records down in the middle of the table with a loud thud. Then tell her to refund the 61 to $1,000 of my combat hazard, pay the exact money that bought this entire fake upper-class facade. Everyone froze. My mom's jaw dropped, her face completely drained of blood. And then I turned to my sister's wealthy fiance. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The suffocating scent of my mother's fake rose perfume flooded my nostrils. My mind violently snapped back to the previous week, to the quiet afternoon, when this nightmare truly began. I had driven onto the base that morning with one simple task: retype my military personnel files from the charity office. My mother ran out of a rented suite downtown. The building smelled like old paper and lies. In the corner, my Aunt Margaret sat behind a filing cabinet, nervously avoiding my gaze, shuffling papers with trembling fingers. She knew I was coming. She always knew more than she let on. I approached the mahogany desk and stopped. The sheepskin ledger lay wide open. Its pages fanned out like a confession nobody bothered to hide. The numbers stared back at me in my mother's sharp, precise handwriting. $19,400 credit card payoff, Eleanor Lee, $15. $1,000 convertible down payment, Sierra Lee, $6,000 annual charity gala catering. All perfectly matching the deposits from my hazard pay. Every single cent routed through a family emergency fund I had been filling since the day I enlisted. Snorts. My aunt shifted in her seat. The filing cabinet drawer she held open rattled against her shaking hand. She had processed every one of these transfers. She had watched every dollar leave my account and land in my mother's purse. And she never said a word. The cold leather of the ledger beneath my fingertips triggered something deeper. A decade earlier, my mother had dropped to her knees on the kitchen floor, mascara streaking down her face, begging me to enlist. My father had bankrupted us. His failed import business had eaten through our savings, our credit, and the second mortgage on our house. I was 17. She grabbed my wrists and squeezed until her nails left marks. She told me I was the only one strong enough. She told me the family would collapse without me. I believed her. I signed the enlistment papers the week I turned 18. I remembered the freezing rain during basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, the 50-pound ruck marches that shredded the skin on my shoulders, the 2 a.m. wake-ups, the screaming drill sergeants, the night I lay in the barracks, staring at the ceiling with tears running sideways into my ears because my body hurt so badly I could not roll over. I remember calling home after my first week of training. My mother picked up, and before I could say a word about the bruises on my feet, or the sergeant who made me low crawl through gravel for 45 minutes, she asked when the first direct deposit would hit. Not how I was, not if I was eating, when the money would arrive. I hung up and sat on the concrete floor of the latrine with my back against the cold cinder block wall, and I did not call home again for 3 months. I did it to save them. I sent my first paycheck home before I even bought myself a decent pair of boots. But looking at these receipts, the truth clicked into place with the sickening precision of a round being chambered. My mother hated my uniform because it smelled like poverty, because it reminded her of the blue-collar roots she spent her whole life running from. Yet she ruthlessly mined my blood to buy her aristocracy. A month after I left for boot camp, she was paying elite private school tuition for my younger sister, Sierra. Sierra got ballet lessons and brandame clothes. I got frostbite and a stress fracture in my left shin. The rhythmic clicking of heels echoed down the hallway. My mother walked in, porcelain teacup in hand, sipping Earl Grey like she was hosting a garden party. She did not flinch, seeing me hold the ledger. My Aunt Margaret silently scurried out of the room, too cowardly to witness what came next. The door clicking shut behind her. My mother just smirked, her eyes traveling from my combat boots up to my face, with a look of practiced contempt. Why do you have that look on your face? You're a soldier. The military takes care of your food and housing. They issue your clothes. You don't have any personal needs that require money. She took another elegant sip, the steam curling past her cheekbone. She had just erased my humanity in a single breath, reduced 10 years of sacrifice to a line item that did not deserve compensation. The teacup clinked against the saucer. She set it down on the desk, right on top of the ledger page that showed the $15,000 payment for Sierra's convertible. My throat constricted. I planted both palms flat on the mahogany and leaned forward until I could smell the bergamot on her breath. You used my salary to pay off Sierra's car loan and to keep this delusional charity fund running. My hands shook with suppressed rage. The tendons in my forearms stood out like cables. She did not blink. She did not even set down her tea. That is your responsibility to the Lee family. Grace, 5 words. She saw an ATM, not a daughter. She saw a supply line, not a human being. I tightened the nylon strap of my combat watch until the buckle bit into my wrist. The pain focused me. I did not argue. I did not scream. I committed every number on that ledger to memory, photographed 3 pages with my phone, while she sipped her tea and walked out. The door closed behind me, with a soft click that sounded louder than a gunshot. The soldier in me had just acquired a hostile target. Thick gray fog swallowed the base the next morning. The corrugated iron walls of the intelligence office radiated cold. No heater. The overhead fluorescent buzzed and flickered, casting everything in a sickly pale wash. I dropped the copied financial statements onto Captain Diane Carter's steel desk, hard enough to scatter her paperwork. Snorts. Diane looked up from her terminal, took one glance at my face, and poured 2 cups of black coffee without asking a single question. A junior intelligence officer at the adjacent workstation glanced over, caught the tension radiating off both of us, and suddenly found an urgent reason to check the supply room. The door banged shut behind him. Diane pulled the statement toward her and began scanning the transaction matrix with the predatory focus I had watched her use on enemy communications intercepts for 3 years. She's snorts did not offer sympathy. She did not tilt her head and say she was sorry. She treated the documents like what they were, evidence of a crime. Diane grabbed her red pen and slammed it against the steel desk, circling a cluster of transactions that formed a repeating pattern across 18 months. She's not just spending your money, Grace. This is textbook money laundering. She dragged her finger across the highlighted entries. My mother had routed my family emergency fund deposits through her charity's operating account, then redistributed them as reimbursements to herself, to my father, and to vendors that did not exist. The fake charity was a washing machine. Every dollar I earned dodging roadside bombs in hostile territory came out the other end smelling like philanthropy and tax deductions. Diane flipped to a page showing a $6 Souzen catering invoice for a gala that, according to the venue's public calendar, never happened. The memory of my mother skipping my officer commissioning ceremony to fly to New York for a shopping weekend suddenly made sickening sense. She had been in Manhattan spending my promotion bonus on a designer handbag. The same afternoon, I raised my right hand and swore to defend a country that included her ungrateful existence. My stomach twisted. The coffee turned to acid in my throat. I pressed my back against the cold metal chair and stared at the fluorescent light until the buzzing filled my skull. But why? Why me? They're my parents. The words came out as a whisper. My voice cracked on the last syllable. Diane set down her pen. She looked at me with the kind of brutal clarity that made her the best analyst in the battalion and the worst person to lie to. Because you're the perfect prey, Grace. You're the only one carrying the guilt she implanted in you since you were a child. Diane leaned forward. She explained what I already knew but could not name. My mother had spent my entire childhood programming me to believe that my worth was measured by what I gave. She despised my independence because it threatened her control. So, she punished me by tying my finances to her emotional blackmail. Sierra was never asked to contribute a cent. Sierra was the golden child, the one who got the ballet lessons and the private school and the convertible. I was the ATM, the scapegoat, the expendable asset deployed to fund the family's fraudulent upper-class fantasy. I looked down at my hands. My nails had dug so deep into my palms that 4 crescent-shaped cuts were bleeding. I thought of the freezing nights guarding ammunition dumps outside Bram, wrapped in a poncho liner that smelled like diesel and sand. Also, my mother could carry a Hermes bag to a charity luncheon that existed only on paper. I thought of the care packages I never received. The birthdays nobody called for, the holidays I spent in a masal eating turkey from a foil tray, while my family drank champagne in a dining room paid for with my combat pay. The pain evaporated. It did not fade. It evaporated like water hitting a hot engine block, and what remained was freezing tactical clarity. I wiped the blood from my palms on my uniform trousers, pulled Diane's keyboard toward me, and opened an encrypted spreadsheet. My fingers moved fast. Column A, transaction dates. Column B, amounts. Column C, routing numbers. Column D, recipient. They were no longer family. They were a hostile network, and the demolition campaign had begun. A week passed with zero contact from any of them. No calls, no texts, not even a forwarded prayer chain email from my aunt, which was how I knew they were busy. Late one night, I sat on my bunk chewing on a dry ration bar that tasted like cardboard and salt. I opened social media on my phone, scrolling past recruitment ads and memes from my platoon. Then my thumb stopped. The screen punched me in the stomach harder than any Combives drill ever had. Sierra had posted a public photo captioned with a champagne emoji and the words, "The best engagement celebration in Vegas, baby." The image was crisp and bright. There was my mother draped in a gold sequin dress holding a flute of Dom Perignon. My father stood beside her in a new sport coat, his arm around Sierra's waist. Julian was laughing, his Rolex catching the neon light. And in the background, clutching a designer purse she most certainly did not buy with her own money, was my Aunt Margaret smiling for the camera in a VIP casino suite that probably cost more per night than I made in a week. Just 4 weeks earlier, my father had called me at 2 left in the morning, sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Snorts. He said he needed emergency heart surgery. He said the insurance would not cover it. He said if I did not wire $12,000 immediately, he might not survive the month. I worked double shifts for 3 weeks straight. I skipped meals. I deferred my vehicle maintenance. I sent the money. And here they were, all of them gambling with it under crystal chandeliers in Las Vegas, while I sat on a cot eating a ration bar that expired 6 months ago. Margaret was the one who disgusted me the most in that photo. She knew every single penny came from my hazard pay. She had processed the transfers herself. She had watched my father rehearse that phone call about his heart had probably helped him practice the crying, and she stood in that casino suite with a designer purse on her arm and a coward smile on her face. She was not just a bystander. She was an accomplice in a family-sized fraud ring, and the only thing she feared losing was her seat at the table. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. It rang 5 times. The background noise was deafening slot machines, chiming bass thumping from a nearby lounge, ice clinking in glasses that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Grace, I'm listening." Her voice trembled over the chaos. I spoke with the icy precision of a sniper, adjusting for windage. "Aunt Margaret enjoying the Vegas trip. Is the casino suite comfortable? Was my dad's heart surgery money enough to buy everyone gambling chips for tonight?" Dead silence on her end. The slot machines kept ringing. I heard her heels clicking fast across a tile floor, scrambling away from the noise, away from witnesses. I heard a man's voice in the background, probably a cocktail waiter, asking if she needed anything, and she shoved past him without answering. A door opened and shut. The casino roar muffled to a dull throb. I could hear her breathing fast and shallow, the breathing of a trapped animal. "Grace, you have to understand." Margaret sobbed, her voice cracking into pieces. "Eleanor forced me to come. If I told the truth, she'd throw me out." She played the victim. The woman who had watched my mother drain my bank account for a decade. who had filed every fraudulent charity receipt, who had smiled at every fake gala photo, was now crying about being forced. She was not a prisoner. She was a willing parasite who fed on scraps from my mother's table and was terrified of losing her place at it. Enough. I snapped the word like a dry branch. The line went dead. I pulled the phone from my ear, opened Margaret's contact, and hit delete. The screen asked if I was sure. I tapped yes without hesitation. Her name vanished from my phone like she had never existed. The last shred of family loyalty I had been carrying for 30 years evaporated with it. The following weekend, I stood at strict attention in the base's Hall of Honor. The walls were lined with photographs of decorated officers, combat citations, framed behind glass, and a folded flag from a fallen soldier's memorial that nobody walked past without saluting. Colonel Frank Lee walked in through the double doors. My uncle moved like a man who had spent 40 years giving orders and never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He carried a red sealed dossier in his left hand and his cover tucked under his right arm. He pulled a chair from the oak conference table, set the dossier down with a solid thud, and looked at me with the same steady gaze I imagined he used to brief field commanders before a major offensive. "At ease, Captain," Frank said, sliding the dossier across the polished oak toward me. I had a few contacts in my old intelligence network look into some of Richard's financial matters. "I think you need to see this, Grace." I broke the red wax seal with my thumbnail. The dossier contained a financial probe into my father's hidden accounts, bank records, wire transfers, and a corporate registration document for a shell company based in Delaware that I had never heard of. Frank's eyes burned with a disgust that went far deeper than disappointment. This was a man who had spent 3 combat tours defending a flag that his own brother used as a napkin. Years ago, when I put on the uniform and deployed to the Gulf facing death every single day, your father used a forged power of attorney to drain our father's pension. Frank's jaw tightened. He opened a manila folder inside the dossier and spread 3 photocopied documents across the table: a forged power of attorney from 1995, a bank withdrawal slip, and a fake nursing home transfer request. He told me the full story. While Frank was deployed in a combat zone, sleeping in foxholes, and writing letters home that he was not sure would arrive, because he was not sure he would survive, the week my father was draining our grandfather's accounts. The exemption cost money my father did not have. So, he stole it from my grandfather's military pension. Grandpa Lee, a Korean War veteran who had earned a Purple Heart at Chosin Reservoir, died 2 years later in a veteran's home that could not afford to heat his room in winter because his pension had been gutted. Frank told me he drove 8 hours to reach the hospital when he got the Red Cross notification. But by the time he arrived, Grandpa was already gone. The attending nurse said the old man's last words were asking for his pension check because his room was cold and he wanted an extra blanket. Frank found out after the funeral that the pension was empty. He traced the withdrawal to my father's bank account. He confronted my father at the wake, and my father denied everything, standing next to the casket of the man he had robbed. Frank had not spoken to my father willingly since. The man who lectured me about family duty and sacrifice had built his entire moral authority on a foundation of cowardice and theft. Frank stood rigid, his shoulders squared, his chin level. The fluorescent light caught the silver eagle on his collar. "You're a soldier, Grace. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is right inside your own house wearing the mask of family. It's time you cut off all supply lines. Stop feeding them." If a toxic family member has ever used guilt to bleed you dry, hit that like button. Share how you finally set your boundaries in the comments below. I picked up my phone. Frank watched me without blinking. I dialed my mother's number and put it on speaker. It rang twice. "I'm listening." "Why are you calling at this hour?" Her voice was flat, annoyed, the tone of a woman who expected every call to come with a check attached. I did not hesitate. I did not soften my voice. I delivered the words like a field order. "The deposit for Sierra's engagement restaurant next week. I'm not paying it. And from now on, not a single dollar will be transferred from my account to your fund or to any loan belonging to that household." The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. I heard her inhale sharply. I heard the faint clink of a teacup being set down hard enough to chip the saucer. I hung up. Frank nodded once, a single firm dip of the chin. That nod carried more paternal pride than anything my biological father had ever given me in 28 years. The war was officially on. The morning after I cut the supply line, I sat in front of Diane's secure terminal before the sun came up. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the darkened office. Diane had pulled strings through her intelligence network contacts and Colonel Frank's old connections to run a deep financial background check on my father. The kind of probe that traces international wire transfers and flags offshore corporate registrations. I was hunting his shadows now. The keyboard clicked under my fingers as I navigated through the international credit report data. I remembered my father's voice on that 2 a.m. phone call. The way he choked on every word. The way he said he was scared to die. He had manufactured a medical emergency to steal $12,000 from his eldest daughter. He had performed the role of a dying man, the way a con artist performs grief at a stranger's funeral. He was not afraid of dying, he was afraid of being caught. The results populated line by line. My pulse stayed flat. A savings account registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation linked to my father's Delaware LLC. The balance was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the number until the digits burned into my retinas. While my mother humiliated herself, begging and threatening me for hazard pay, while she used my combat salary to prop up a charity that existed only as a money laundering front, while she screamed about family obligation and accused me of selfishness for asking where my own earnings went. My father had been quietly stockpiling a massive black fund entirely for himself. He let his wife destroy their eldest daughter's finances. He watched it happen. He encouraged it. And the entire time he was hoarding more money than I would earn in 5 years of active duty. The pristine patriarch, the moral hypocrite, the man who preached about family sacrifice while sitting on a pile of offshore cash built on the back of his dead father's stolen pension, a cold, humorless smile crept across my face. The same smile Diane told me I wore right before a tactical exercise went exactly as planned. The desk phone blared. I picked it up before the second ring. My mother's voice hit me like a freight train at full speed. Tonight 6:00 Sharpie at the house immediately. I'm calling an emergency family meeting. You've ruined Sierra's restaurant deposit. Don't think you can run from your duty to this family. Julian's mocking scoff echoed in the background. I could hear him saying something about soldiers who do not know their place. My mother's breathing was heavy with fury. She expected me to crumble. She expected the guilt programming to kick in the way it always had, the way it had worked flawlessly for 10 years. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. I did not explain, I'll be there on time. I stated it flatly and disconnected the line. I stood up and walked to the heavy-duty printer in the corner of the office. I fed the first document into the tray and pressed print. The rhythmic whirring of the machine filled the room like a war drum building toward a charge. I printed the 2-year financial statements proving my $61,000 in stolen wages. Every transfer, every routing number, every fraudulent charity receipt. Then I printed the Cayman Islands dossier. Every page of the offshore account records. The shell company registration, the balance sheet that proved my father was a wealthy liar who bled his daughter dry for sport. I stamped the Cayman dossier with a red marker, sealing each page with a date and authentication note. I stacked every sheet in order, secured them with binder clips, and packed them into my black military briefcase. The leather handle was cool and heavy in my palm. I latched the brass buckles and set it upright on the desk. I checked my watch. I had 12 hours before the family meeting. I pulled my class dress uniform from the garment bag hanging on the back of the office door and inspected every ribbon, every crease, every brass button, the combat service ribbon from my first deployment, the meritorious service medal from my second. The unit citation I earned leading an intelligence team that intercepted a weapons shipment bound for an insurgent cell. Every ribbon represented a night. My family slept safely in a warm house paid for, with money I earned in places where the sleep was measured in 90-minute increments between guard shifts. I pressed the creases with my thumbnail. checked the alignment of the brass eagle insignia on each shoulder, and polished the black dress shoes until I could see my reflection in the toe caps. Diane walked in carrying 2 coffees and saw the uniform laid out on the desk next to the briefcase. She did not say a word. She set the coffee down, tapped the edge of the briefcase once with her knuckle, and walked out. She understood. Tonight, I was not walking into my parents' dining room as their obedient cash machine. I was walking in as a United States Army captain, executing a tactical operation against a hostile network. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times. I gripped the briefcase handle so tight the veins in my forearm bulged against the skin. I kicked the dining room doors open with the heel of my dress shoe. The heavy oak swung inward and cracked against the wall's stopper. Every head at the table snapped toward me. I stood in the doorway in my full class, a Army captain uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases. Every campaign ribbon pinned in perfect alignment. The brass eagle insignia on my shoulders catching the chandelier light. My mother glared from the head of the table, her eyes narrowing with the contempt she reserved exclusively for me. Sierra sat to her left, scrolling on her phone, looking annoyed at the interruption. My father occupied the far end, adjusting his cufflinks. His jaw sat in the stiff posture of a man pretending to be above the situation. Aunt Margaret sat with her head down, staring at her empty plate like she was hoping the porcelain would swallow her whole. Julian sat beside Sierra, his chair angled away from the table, legs crossed, swirling a tumbler of whiskey, with the lazy arrogance of a man who believed his net worth determined his rank in every room. Julian was the first to speak. He leaned back the whiskey, sloshing against the crystal, and let the smirk spread across his face like an oil slick. "Oh, the captain's back. So what? The Army paycheck hasn't come in yet, so you had to wear the full uniform to the family meeting to beg for more time on your debts." My father let out a low chuckle and nodded approvingly at the insult. Sierra glanced up from her phone and rolled her eyes. Margaret pressed her lips together and stared harder at the plate. The room breathed a collective exhale of mockery, the familiar sound of a family that had long agreed on who the joke was. I did not respond. I marched to the center of the table, lifted my black military briefcase, and drove it down onto the mahogany surface. The thud was heavy and final, like a coffin lid closing. Margaret flinched so violently her water glass rattled. Sierra dropped her phone. Julian's whiskey froze mid-swirl, the ice cubes suspended. My mother's fingers curled around the edge of her armrest. I unlatched the brass buckles. The click echoed in the silence. I pulled out the first stack of receipts, fanned them across the polished wood, and slid them toward the center so every person at the table could see the numbers. "Let's begin." I commanded, my voice level and cold, the same tone I used to brief a room of intelligence officers before a high-stakes operation. $61,000. Everyone hear that clearly? That is the total amount I have paid for this family in just the last 2 years. Of that, $34,400 went straight to Mom's credit card debt and the down payment for Sierra's convertible. I tapped the stack of receipts twice with my index finger. Each tap was deliberate. Each tap was a nail in a coffin. Julian stared at Sierra with a look of dawning horror, the realization crawling across his face that the woman he was about to marry did not earn anything she wore, drove, or lived in. Sierra's lips parted, but no sound came out. She turned to our mother, searching for a denial for the protective wall of lies that had always shielded her. My mother leapt to her feet. The chair scraped against the hardwood with a scream. The elegant mask cracked down the middle, her face contorted into something feral. The manicured socialite disintegrating in real time, replaced by the desperate cornered animal underneath. "You're lying, you ungrateful wretch," she shrieked, her voice climbing to a pitch that rattled the chandelier crystals. "That is your obligation. I gave birth to you. You owe this family your life." I fanned the remaining receipts out across the mahogany in a single sweep, like dealing a hand of cards, each one face up, each one annotated with dates, routing numbers, and amounts that matched her spending to the penny. I don't owe anyone, and here is the proof down to the last cent. My mother's mouth opened and closed. She looked at the receipts spread across her expensive dining table, and saw her own handwriting staring back at her, the same ledger entries I had photographed in her charity office. My father's face had turned the color of wet cement. Julian set his whiskey down slowly, his hand trembling, staring at the financial wreckage of the family he was about to join. Before my mother could launch another manipulative attack, I reached into the briefcase and pulled the red-stamped dossier. I did not slide it. I did not place it gently. I threw it directly at my father's chest. The impact knocked him back in his chair. The binder clip burst open, and the papers rained down around him, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves, scattering across the dining table, landing in Margaret's lap, catching in the chandelier light as they fell. And this is why I will never let me repeat, never enable this hypocritical family for another second. I declared, my voice cutting through the paper storm. An offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The balance runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dead silence. The kind of silence that precedes a detonation. A page from the dossier settled on the tablecloth next to the untouched dinner rolls. My mother slowly turned her head toward my father. Her eyes were bulging. The veins in her neck stood out like ropes. She had manipulated, lied, begged, screamed, and humiliated herself for a decade to extract money from her eldest daughter, only to discover that the man sitting 6 feet away from her had been secretly wealthy the entire time. She had been played by the same con artist who helped her play me. Richard? She hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than the screaming. What is this? You've been hiding money from me. You let me humiliate myself, begging our daughter for cash while you were sitting on all this. My father palled. The confident patriarch who had chuckled at Julian's insults 2 minutes earlier was gone. Sweat poured down his forehead. His hands gripped the armrests so hard his knuckles looked like they were about to tear through the skin. No, Eleanor, calm down. Let me explain. It was emergency savings. He babbled, his voice cracking, the words tumbling over each other like a man trying to stop a building from collapsing with his bare hands. She screamed. The sound was primal, raw, stripped of every layer of upper-class refinement she had spent decades constructing. She grabbed her crystal water glass and hurled it directly at his head. He ducked. The glass shattered against the wall behind him, spraying water and broken crystal across the antique sideboard. A shard skidded across the mahogany and stopped against the stack of receipts that still lay fanned out in the center of the table. My receipts. My evidence now surrounded by the debris of a marriage built on mutual deception. Margaret wailed, her hands over her face, her elbows on the table, begging them to stop, begging someone, anyone, to end this. She rocked back and forth in her chair. The same woman who had smiled in a VIP casino suite 4 weeks ago reduced to a sobbing wreck because the structure she had been clinging to was collapsing and there was nobody left to parasitize. Julian had backed his chair against the wall, his whiskey abandoned on the table, his face cycling between disgust and cold financial calculation. He was already running the numbers, already weighing the reputational cost of being linked to a family that laundered military combat pay through a fake charity. Sierra snorts pressed herself against the back of her chair, her eyes wide, her phone forgotten on the floor, watching the two people who had raised her tear each other apart over stolen money. The golden child was finally seeing the gold for what it was. My blood spun into currency. Right at the peak of the chaos, the front doors of the dining room swung open with enough force to crack the door's stopper against the baseboard. Colonel Frank Lee walked in. He was in civilian clothes, a pressed sport coat and polished Oxfords. But he moved with the authority of a man who had commanded battalions and buried soldiers who were better men than anyone in this room. His shoulders filled the doorframe. His eyes swept the wreckage, the scattered papers, the broken glass, the screaming wife, the cowering husband, the sobbing enabler, and his expression settled into the cold, clinical disgust of a career officer witnessing a dishonorable discharge. A coward who dodged the draft years ago and now is depraved enough to steal his own daughter's blood money. Frank's voice boomed across the wreckage. He did not shout. He did not need to. The bass in his voice carried the weight of 40 years of service and the moral authority that every person in that room had forfeited, Frank looked directly at my father. My father shrank into his chair like a man, watching a judge read a death sentence. As of this moment, you are no brother of mine, Richard. Don't you ever invoke the Lee name to ask for my help again. You are dead to me. Margaret sobbed into her hands. Sierra stared at her uncle with her mouth open. My mother stood frozen, one hand still raised from throwing the glass, her chest heaving, mascara streaking down her face. My father collapsed, not physically. Something behind his eyes caved in the infrastructure of lies and moral posturing that had held him upright for 58 years. Finally buckling under the weight of the truth, he slumped in his chair, his hands dangling at his sides, his mouth working silently, producing nothing. The toxic structure was annihilated from the inside out. Every pillar, every facade, every painted-on smile, every rehearsed speech about family duty and sacrifice, all of it lay in shards on the dining room floor, alongside the broken crystal and the scattered pages of the Cayman dossier. I stepped back from the table. I observed the wreckage with absolute detachment, the same way I had been trained to assess a neutralized target. No satisfaction, no rage, just the clean, cold clarity of a completed mission objective. I've just received transfer orders to a base in Germany. I announced over their whimpering, over my mother's ragged breathing, over Margaret's sobs, over the faint tinkling of broken glass settling on the hardwood. All of my financial support ends tonight. Goodbye. I turned on my heel. My dress shoes clicked against the floor with the measured cadence of a soldier leaving a battlefield. I did not look back. I walked through the front doors, down the stone steps, and into the night air. Behind me, the house erupted in muffled screaming. I could hear my mother's voice, tearing through the walls, could hear my father's panicked pleading, could hear Margaret crying, and Sierra, demanding to know the truth about every dollar she had ever spent. I unlocked my car, set the empty briefcase on the passenger seat, and pulled the door shut. The engine turned over on the first try. I adjusted my rearview mirror and caught one last glimpse of the house. Every window lit up like a building on fire. I pulled onto the main road and drove toward the base without touching the radio. 2 days after the dining room collapsed, the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton downtown dripped in crystal chandeliers and white orchid centerpieces. Despite the internal nuclear meltdown, my parents had forced the family to attend Sierra's engagement gala. Canceling would have been an admission of failure. My mother still had enough pride left to paint over the crater. She wore a new gown, emerald green, purchased on a credit card she could no longer pay. My father sat in a tailored suit, looking like a mannequin propped up in a store window. His eyes hollow, his hands folded in his lap, as though someone had placed them there. Sierra wore a silk wedding dress preview, the kind of rehearsal gown brides wear to their engagement parties, to give the guests a taste of the main event. The diamond ring on her finger caught every chandelier prism in the room. Margaret hovered near the far wall, clutching a champagne flute she had not sipped from scanning every entrance with the panicked vigilance of a woman who expected a bomb. Julian's wealthy venture capital partners mingled with country club members and society columnists. Snorts, a string quartet, played Vivaldi in the corner. The wait staff circulated with silver trays of canopes and flutes of Veuve Clicquot. Everything was pristine, everything was rehearsed, everything was a lie. I walked through the double doors. The sound of my shoes on the marble floor cut through the Vivaldi like a blade through silk. I was in my full-class, a army captain uniform pressed and starched to regulation perfection. Every ribbon pinned in precise alignment, the brass insignia polished until it reflected the chandeliers back at the ceiling. My combat boots had been replaced with black dress shoes, but the uniform itself was unmistakable. It was military. It was blue-collar. It was everything this room pretended not to see. Whispers erupted. The society guests turned their heads like a flock of birds startled by a gunshot. A woman in a Dior gown leaned toward her husband and murmured something behind her hand. A venture capital partner frowned and adjusted his pocket square, as though the uniform was a dress code violation that personally offended him. Julian spotted me from the VIP table and his face went white. My mother gripped the edge of the tablecloth. Sierra stared at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. I did not stop. I did not scan the room. I marched straight for the main stage where the MC was mid-sentence, welcoming guests and praising the beautiful couple. I stepped onto the platform, took the microphone from his hand, and gripped it the way I gripped a sidearm, firm, deliberate, and with absolute intent to use it. The feedback screech cut through the ballroom like a siren. Every conversation died mid-syllable. 200 heads turned toward the stage. The string quartet stopped playing. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the marble floor, and nobody bent down to clean it up. Hello, everyone. I apologize for the interruption. I am Grace Lee, the bride's older sister and a captain in the United States Army. My voice thundered through the speakers. It bounced off the marble walls and the crystal chandeliers and the oil paintings of country landscapes and landed squarely in the chest of every person in the room. I could see my mother's face from the stage. She had turned the color of the white orchid centerpiece. My father gripped the arms of his chair. Margaret pressed her champagne flute against her chest like a shield. I lifted a leather ledger from under my arm. The same sheepskin ledger I had found on my mother's desk, now bound in a white satin ribbon wrapped like a gift. Today, on this joyous occasion, I bring the most special, the most honored engagement gift for my sister. I descended the 3 steps from the stage, walked directly to the VIP table, where my parents sat paralyzed, and placed the ledger down on the white linen tablecloth in front of Sierra. The impact knocked over a crystal vase of white roses. Water spread across the cloth, soaking into the leather of the ledger, darkening the white ribbon. Nobody moved to mop it up. Nobody breathed. I straightened my back and turned to face the ballroom. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto mine. A man in a pinstriped suit at the 3rd table set down his fork. A woman in pearls covered her mouth with a manicured hand. A venture capital partner, who had been laughing with Julian 5 minutes ago, slowly pushed his chair back from his table, creating distance, the instinct of a man who senses an explosion and wants to be outside the blast radius. I could feel the chandeliers humming above me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, steady, controlled 62 beats per minute, the resting pulse of a soldier who had trained for this exact kind of high-pressure engagement. My Margaret. I pointed at my aunt, who was pressing herself against the wall near the service entrance. Her face hidden behind her champagne flute, she flinched. The glass trembled in her hand. Tell everyone here how you used my blood and sweat money to pay off this family's gambling bills in Vegas. Margaret let out a sound that was not quite a word. Her knees buckled. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble. And this time, the sound echoed across the dead, silent ballroom, like a pistol crack. A waiter standing nearby took 3 steps backward. The society guests at the nearest table exchanged glances of horrified fascination, the kind of look people wear at a car accident they cannot turn away from. I pivoted 90 degrees to face my parents. My mother was gripping the edge of the table so hard her acrylic nails were bending backward. My father had sunk low in his chair, his chin nearly touching his chest, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as though he could disappear into the linen. Mom, Dad, stand up proudly and tell the guests about the black fund hidden in the Caymans, and how you drained your own daughter's blood to maintain this lie, to maintain this upper-class facade. A collective gasp rolled through the ballroom. Someone at a far table stood up to get a better view. A society columnist near the bar pulled out her phone and began recording. My mother's face went through 6 different expressions in 2 seconds. Shock, fury, humiliation, calculation, desperation, and finally complete surrender. She did not stand. Her legs would not hold her. My father did not move at all. He sat like a man who had already been sentenced and was simply waiting to be escorted from the courtroom. Sierra slowly turned to face our parents. The silk of her preview wedding gown rustled in the silence. Her mouth was open. Her eyes were filling with tears. But these were not the tears of a bride overwhelmed with joy. These were the tears of a woman watching the foundation of her entire life disintegrate in real time. She looked at the ledger on the table in front of her, at the numbers written in our mother's handwriting, at the proof that every luxury she had ever enjoyed, every designer handbag, every ballet lesson, every convertible, every semester of private school had been purchased with money, stolen from her older sister's combat pay. The disgust that spread across Sierra's face was total. She looked at our mother, the way you look at a stranger who has just been exposed as a criminal. I turned to Julian. He was standing now, his fists clenched, his Rolex glinting under the chandelier light. The arrogant smirk was gone. In its place was the rigid, trembling rage of a man who has just discovered that the empire he was about to marry into was built on fraud. And Julian, you once said my military rank wasn't worth as much as your Rolex. But you know what? The silk wedding gown your fiance is wearing, the expensive diamond ring on her finger. They were all bought with the combat pay you always sneered at. Congratulations on joining a family of professional parasites. The words landed like mortars. Julian's face went from red to white to red again in the span of 3 seconds. He looked at Sierra, he looked at the ring on her finger, he looked at the gown she was wearing. And the calculation that passed behind his eyes was brutal and instantaneous. The same calculation a venture capitalist makes when he discovers a startup has been cooking its books. He grabbed his crystal tumbler and hurled it at the floor. The glass exploded against the marble with a crack that made half the room jump. Champagne sprayed across the legs of the VIP table. The wedding is off, Julian announced, his voice shaking with fury, ripping the veneer from his lapel and throwing it onto the wet tablecloth. My mother collapsed. Her knees gave out and she crumpled into her chair, then slid sideways until Margaret and a terrified waiter caught her. Her emerald gown pulled around her on the marble floor like a puddle of green paint. She was sobbing, but no sound came out. Her mouth was open and her chest was heaving, but the humiliation had crushed her voice box. She could not even produce tears. She just shook her hands, clawing at the tablecloth, pulling the soaked linen and the shattered vase and the ledger down onto herself like a burial shroud. I set the microphone down on the edge of the stage. The soft thud of it landing was the loudest sound in the room. I turned on my heel and walked toward the double doors. My shoes clicked against the marble. 200 people watched me cross the ballroom in absolute silence. A waiter stepped aside. A guest pressed herself against the wall to let me pass. I pushed through the double doors and stepped into the hotel lobby. The night air hit my face. Cool, clean, free. I walked to my car, opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I stayed like that for 30 seconds, letting the adrenaline drain. Then I started the engine. 6 months later, the freezing, crisp air of the Bavarian Alps filled my lungs like a first breath. The wind hammered the American flag against the steel flagpole on the parade ground, the fabric snapping hard enough to sound like distant rifle reports. I stood at attention in my dress uniform, on a military installation in Germany, receiving a unit commendation from the base commander for outstanding performance in intelligence operations. The medal was pinned to my chest by a 2-star general who shook my hand and told me my country was proud. The German soldiers in the formation saluted alongside my American platoon. The base chaplain delivered the invocation, and when he spoke about sacrifice, I felt the word land differently than it ever had before. Sacrifice was no longer a chain someone used to drag me back. It was something I gave freely to people who earned it. Beside me stood Diane, her uniform pressed as sharp as mine. A grin on her face she could not suppress despite her best effort at military bearing. She had put in for the transfer to Germany the same week I did, telling the assignment officer she went where her people went. No further explanation needed. And behind her arms, folded across his chest, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching his legacy unfold exactly as he had hoped, stood Colonel Frank Lee, retired, but still carrying himself like he could take command of the parade ground with a single word. They had flown across the Atlantic Ocean, crossed 6 time zones, and spent 2 days in transit just to be there when my name was called. True family, the kind that does not require blood, the kind that is earned. My phone vibrated in my pocket during the reception. Afterward, I stepped away from the group, walked to a stone wall overlooking the valley, and opened a long email from Sierra. She had written it in paragraphs that read like a confession. The fallout had been total and irreversible. The upper-class social circle had erased our parents overnight. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. The women my mother had brunched with for a decade suddenly could not remember her name. Julian's venture capital firm issued a public statement distancing itself from the Lee family, and two of his partners threatened to dissolve the fund if any association remained. The country club revoked their membership, citing conduct unbecoming, and changed the locks on the locker room. The Society columnist, who recorded my speech at the gala, published an article that went viral in the regional press, picked up by 3 national outlets, and shared over 40,000 times. My parents were forced to sell the mansion within 3 months. The real estate agent told Sierra that the buyers negotiated the price down by 15% because of the publicity. My parents moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood my mother would have driven past without slowing down a year earlier. My father's offshore accounts were flagged for review by the IRS after an anonymous tip that I suspect Frank had a hand in. Margaret moved in with a distant cousin in Ohio and stopped answering her phone. Sierra had quit her fake public relations director job, a title my mother had invented for her at the charity that no longer existed, and was working an entry-level administrative position at a small firm downtown. She was paying off her own debts for the first time in her life. The convertible was repossessed. The diamond ring was returned to the jeweler. I scrolled to the final lines of her email. The font changed the way it does when someone switches from typing fast to typing slowly, choosing every word with care. I'm sorry, Grace. I was too naive, too careless, and I lived in luxury on top of your pain. You don't have to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know I'm trying to change, trying to live an honest life with my own 2 hands. I read the words twice. The wind coming off the Alps pressed against my back. The American flag snapped overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle was playing evening colors, the notes hanging in the cold mountain air, like a requiem for something that had finally been laid to rest. I opened a reply. I typed slowly. I chose every word the way I would choose a placement for a load-bearing wall. Something that would hold weight. Something that would stand. I forgive you, Sierra. Stand on your own 2 feet. That's the best way to make amends. But as for Mom and Dad, the boundary has been set. I will permanently erase them from my life. Take care of yourself. I pressed send. The message disappeared into the digital ether, crossing time zones and oceans and the vast wreckage of a family that had been built on exploitation and held together by silence. I locked the screen. The phone went dark in my hand. I looked out at the German sky. It was clear and pale blue and stretched to the edge of the mountains. The air tasted like pine and frost and freedom. For the first time in 10 years, there was no guilt, no obligation, no phone call coming at 2 in the morning with a rehearsed emergency and a demand for money. No ledger, no receipts. Behind me, Frank called my name. I turned. He was standing with Diane, both of them holding paper cups of bad military coffee, the kind that tastes like motor oil and regret. Frank waved me over. Diane held up her phone for a picture. I slid my phone into my pocket and walked toward them. The gravel crunched under my boots. The flag snapped in the wind. The mountains rose up behind us like a fortress nobody could tear down. If you believe that true family is built on respect, not blood and exploitation, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to walk away to save.